Age of Overlord is here, and you need to know which hand traps are the most important to beat the best meta decks. What's potion? You got Matt here, and welcome back to the Competitive YuGiOh video. Today, we're talking about hand traps post Age of Overlord and how they interact with the best meta decks. We've got a brand new format that we're all trying to figure out, and this video should help with that. So, if you're excited for the video, then do me a favor and smash the like button. If this video hits 60 likes, I'll bring you an amazing guide on the best board breakers post Age of Overlord and how they interact with the best meta decks as well. Also, if you enjoy deck profiles, combos, meta discussions, and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos just like this one, you're gonna love the content here. So make sure to subscribe and help us reach our end of year goal of 2,000 subscribers. That being said, here's the ultimate guide for the best hand traps in the post Age of Overlord competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. Let's jump into it. Okay, so I have 6 different categories for each of these hand traps to describe their playability and how good they are in the post Age of Overlord format. The first one is going to be most main decks, then we have some main decks, we then have most side decks, with some side decks, we have niche, and then we have just don't play these hand traps in this last tier. So let's go ahead and jump on into it, starting off with the very first hand trap we're talking about, which will be Artifact Lancea. Now, Lancea is great at stopping banishing effects, which has a lot of utility in some metagames, but right now, it's only really good against one deck, and in my opinion, that's going to be Dragon Link, because that deck banishes quite a bit, especially because of the Bystials. It's solid against a lot of different decks, including Floowandereeze, Horus, Chimera Branded, and quite a few other things, but most of the decks it's up against, it's going to be pretty bad. Think of something like Unchained. They want to keep their cards in the graveyard. They don't want them to get banished. Sprite doesn't really care. Neither does Purely or Vanquish Soul for that matter. There's just so many options and so many cards that do not care about Artifact Lancea right now that, in my opinion, it should be falling in the niche tier. Next up is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. This is one of the best hand traps in the game, and I can make an argument for it still being the best hand trap in Yu-Gi-Oh today. It has a really wide application against a ton of competitive meta decks, but also against a ton of rogue decks. Think about the best meta decks right now. It's great against Rescue Ace for Hydrant. It's great against Purely for Purely or Purelily or any of the spell cards. It's great against Unchained for the traps. It's great against Chimera Branded for Branded Fusion or even Baphomet. It's amazing on Flu for Rabina and Eglin. Sprite for Gigantic. Vanquish Soul for Stake Your Soul. Dragon Link for Ravine or Tracer or more. And Labyrinth, of course, for the Welcome Traps. And Tearlament on the Millers, which is obviously a huge range of cards. There are so many different cards that can be hit by Ash Blossom. So Ash Blossom will be the first card to join the category for playable in most main decks, and honestly, any deck that can play hand traps should be playing Ash Blossom right now, in my opinion. Next up are the Bystials, Druid's Worm, and Magnamut. I have them both over here because one is just slightly better than the other one is right now. In general, Bystials are going to be really good in certain formats. They are very format reliant because if there's a lot of light or dark monsters, then yes, they can put in a lot of work. Just look back to tier format, how good they were back then. Right now, they're not as good because there's a lot of decks that don't utilize light or dark monsters. The Bystials are all great against decks like Tearlament, Branded, or even Dragon Link. They're solid against decks like Manadian or Labyrinth, Horus for Imseti because it's a dark, and pretty much the rest of the best decks, but they're really bad against decks like Floowandereeze or Rescue Ace. Even decks like Vanquish Soul they struggle with quite a bit because the impact they have is just not as significant as for other decks. Thanks to the limitation of Bystial Magnamut, it's not as consistent to see the card, but it's also just not as good as Bystial Druid's Worm right now. Think of a deck like Unchained. They absolutely hate dealing with Bystial Druid's Worm. The extra piece of interruption that they provide is so good. So right now, I'm going to put Bystial Druid's Worm slightly ahead of Bystial Magnamut, but both of them will be settled right in the most side decks tier. Chaos Hunter is just a bad card. This is the format of Thrust and Talent, where they're at their best. And if you're going to be using a monster effect, you need to make sure you get the most amount of value and impact for that card. Chaos Hunter does neither of those things. First of all, most decks don't really care if they can't banish too much. And on top of that, Chaos Hunter, just to summon it out, you have to go neg1. Discarding a card to summon it out can be very low impact and cost you a lot over the course of a long duel. Now, granted, this card has some application against some decks in the future, but right now it's just really struggle. So for that reason, I'm putting it as the first card in the just don't category. Contact C is a very interesting card because in theory, it can stop your opponent from doing whatever their game plan wants them to do while using the extra deck. But in practice, it's really not going to be that good because not every deck needs to use the extra deck, number one, but number two, and more importantly, every top tier deck right now is going to be playing a card called SP Little Knight, which was just released in Age of Overlord. This card, SP Little Knight, is the best card from that set and one of the best cards in Yu-Gi-Oh today. And the fact that it is a generic Link 2 that offers 2 forms of interruption is so strong. So you're giving your opponent now a free body to go into SP Little Knight, which is not a good decision at all, in my opinion. And for that reason, you just don't play this card. Do not play Contact C in any way, shape, or form, in my opinion. Next up is DD Crow, and I love DD Crow for this format. It is going to be one of the best hand traps by far for this format for a few different reasons. Number one, it can hit cards that Bystials just can't. Think of cards like Rescue Ace monsters or Shayama in Unchained, any of the Horus monsters to stop them from getting those bodies, or Vanadium Tuners in the graveyard, and so much more. And second, it doesn't leave a body on the board, which is so important for triple tactics thrust. So instead of talking about every deck that DD Crow is good against, here's the decks that it's actually just bad against. Fluandereeze, and that's pretty much it. Honestly, the most impactful thing you can hit is going to be Dreaming Town from their graveyard, and even then, it's not going to be that big of a difference since it's a one-of card. I can make an argument that you can side in DD Crow against basically every single meta deck right now. Does that mean you should? No, of course not. There are more likely than not going to be better applications for other hand traps against these other decks, but as a generic catch-all for a wide-ranged meta, this is a fantastic card to have. So, in my opinion, you're going to see it in some main decks. Next up is Dimension Shifter, one of the most oppressive hand traps ever created. It is really good against a lot of different strategies, including Unchained, Tierlist, Vanadium, Dragonlink, Horus, Labyrinth, and even Branded Chimera is really good against that too. I will say though that Unchained can play through D-Shifter. Their board is just going to be less powerful and they won't have as much recursion for the following turn, so just keep that in mind. They can definitely OTK you through it. It's solid against decks like Purely or Vanquish Soul, and it's really bad against decks like Rescue Ace and Fluandereeze, and they can just play the card themselves. While D-Shifter is so good against so many different matchups, you have to have the right deck to be able to use it. You have to have a deck that doesn't care about having their cards banished or about having cards in their graveyard at all. So for that reason, I can't put it into the top tier. Instead, it's going to be joining DD Crow in the some main decks tier. Droll and Lockbird is another card that is either going to be amazing or just average. So many decks just don't care about Droll at all, but other decks have a really hard time dealing with it. Think of a deck like Vanadium or Dragonlink or even Fluandereeze. These decks all have cards that add from their main deck to their hand over and over again, so if you can stop that in its tracks, then their board is not going to be anywhere near as formidable, and you can definitely get the KO on the crackback. The card does have some bad matchups, so for that reason it can't be played in most main decks in my opinion, but because the combo pile decks are so strong right now, you definitely have to respect them, and the only way you can respect them without losing to them right away is by playing Droll and Lockbird. So I think it's a fantastic card to side deck, and will see play in most side decks. Next up is Effect Veiler, and honestly, targeted effect negation right now is really solid. Pretty much every deck has a card that they hate to have Veilered or Impermed, so right now, Veiler is seeing a good amount of play. The problem with Veiler though is it's not even the best type of Effect Veiler. Infinite Impermanence just does a much better job. Veiler can only be activated on your opponent's turn and only on their opponent's turn, and on top of that it makes thrusts and talents live, which can be detrimental to your chances of winning a game, especially because those cards are seeing play in pretty much every single meta deck right now. It sees some fringe use in main decks like Runic and Plunder Patrol because they draw a lot on their opponent's turn, and you can activate the effect of Effect Veiler right away even if you control a card, unlike Infinite Impermanence. Effect Veiler is great against decks like Rescue Ace and Dragonlink and even more, but the problem is unless you need 3 more copies of Imperm, it's not really going to see so much play. Speaking of Imperm, I was going to go in alphabetical order here, but Imperm and Veiler are just so similar that it felt like we should talk about it right now. Imperm is basically just better Effect Veiler in pretty much every single way. The fact that you can use this card going first or going second, you can use it during the standby phase is great, and you can set it face down to get a bonus effect is really strong. Pretty much every single main deck should be playing Infinite Impermanence if they play hand traps, because not only is it effect negation, which is great this format, but it also doesn't make thrust and talents live, which as I mentioned earlier, are so critical to the success of decks in the format today. For that reason, it's going to be the next card to join Ash Blossom and be playable in most main decks tier. Next up is Fantastical Dragon Phantazmay. Now, of the top meta decks, not many of them link summon, with one exception. SP Little Knight is now legal. Pretty much every top meta deck will be playing that card, and it is a link monster, so getting out Phantazmay is great. On top of that, Little Knight does target, and having Phantazmay for targeting negation and protection is so useful. Now, there are other decks that allow you to really take advantage of this card. Decks like Unchained and Dragonlink, if you Phantazmay them at the right time, it can be really beneficial for you. On top of that, it can mulligan your hand, which is really nice, and while it does get a body on board to make thrust even better than it actually is, the fact that you get that targeting protection is even more important in my opinion. It's really bad against decks like Fluandereeze, Branded Chimera, Purely, even Labyrinth because they don't use the extra deck too much, but it is really good against quite a few other decks, so for that reason, it's going to see play in some side decks. Moving on to the Ghost Sisters, we start off with Ghost, Belle, and Haunted Mansion, and honestly, it's not its format. There are a lot of effects that move cards from the graveyard to the field, but there's not one card that is just absolutely game-warpingly powerful or a floodgate that just stops you from playing the game. Think back to how Branded used Gimmick Puppet Nightmare to lock you out of playing the game. So you want to have access to Ghost Belle to stop them from doing that, which was obviously very important. There aren't many cards being summoned from the graveyard doing something that oppressive right now, so for that reason it's not seeing too much play. Now, it has some usefulness against a lot of different decks, but unless your deck specifically needs it for whatever reason, I wouldn't really use it. Think of a deck like Vanquished Soul. It loves that Ghost Belle is an Earth monster because you can reveal them for the powerful effects. Also, with the effects of Heavy Borger, you can draw it on your opponent's turn and still use it right away. Again, that has its usefulness. But overall, the impact it has on the wider meta right now isn't that strong. But that being said, I can't put it into the bottom tier because at the end of the day, it's still a good card with application against many decks, just not that strong against all those decks. So for that reason, if your deck can play it, I would put it into the niche category. Our second Ghost Sister is going to be Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill, which has some application as an effect negation, but also as a way to win in time. The problem is, of the 3 ways to effect negate as a hand trap, Impermanence, Veiler, and this card here, it's the worst. By far, and the reason why is you have to use it on the summon of the monster. Also, it only works on special summon monsters too. So if your opponent decides to have a activated ignition effect, then this card doesn't really do too much because they don't have to activate the effect. But if they're going to special something out and have the effect happen on summon, then yes, it can have a lot of usefulness. For the time being, I'm going to put Ghost Mourner into the some side decks tier, and that's for a few reasons. The first of which is going to be that it's just better than the cards in the niche tier right now. And second is that, while it's not the best form of effect negation, it is still effect negation, which is always going to be very good. Up next is Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, and honestly, Ghost Ogre kind of comes in and out of the formats over and over again, but right now, post Age of Overlord, I think Ghost Ogre is going to be one of the most impactful hand traps of the format for a few reasons. First of which, think about all the cards that Age of Overlord released. You have the Die Bellstar engine, you have the Horus engine, SP Little Knight. These cards here are so weak to Ghost Ogre, it is crazy. If you go in Ghost Ogre, King Sarcophagus, you're in a great position. If you Ghost Ogre, Die Bellstar, they no longer have the monster on field to send off the original Sinful Spoils. If you Ghost Ogre Little Knight's second effect, then they can't banish either card, which is really strong. It does have some application against other cards like field spells and just generic cards in general, but it's not as impactful against these cards as it would be against these new cards from the Age of Overlord. But in general, because of the impact that those cards are going to have on the meta today, I do believe that we're going to see an uptick in Ghost Ogre in the upcoming format. So it's for that reason that I believe that Ghost Ogre will see play in most side decks. Next up is Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. Honestly, theoretically, it has some uses, but just don't play it, okay? There are so many better hand traps to use other than Ghost Reaper, so I would just choose those instead. For that reason, it's going to go into the just don't category. Same thing goes for Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood. Why play this card? It's not effect negation, it only helps in time, and even then, it's not even that good in time. There's just most of the time going to be better options to win when time's been called in the round. So honestly, find another option, do not play Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood. Gnomaterial can be theoretically really good. The problem is there are so many better options that can do basically the same thing. We're entering a format where Spellbound is going to be a pretty good card, which is basically just going to be a better form of Gnomaterial, so just keep that in mind. Sure, if you hit Dragon Link or Purely or even Unchained at the right time, their decks can't really do too much, but why not play a more impactful hand trap that's good against a lot of other decks and even the road decks of the format? Honestly, just don't play it. Moving on to Nibiru the Primal Being, the big rock is here and it is quite good. It can hit many meta decks right now because not all of them are going to be able to get up and negate before 5 summons, and a lot of them just fold to Nibiru in general. The problem is, while every top deck can play into Nibiru, most of them can play around it as well. They can either have extra pieces of negation, or they can have additional extenders, or they can have interruptions, or they can have follow-up, whatever it might be. But if you pair Nibiru with something else, it can be absolutely incredible. Now, every rogue deck has to fear Nibiru, and every meta deck has to respect it at least, so for that reason, I'm going to be putting it into the some main decks tier. Moving on to PSY-Framegear Gamma, if there is a niche hand trap, this is it. Gamma is such an incredible card, but there are so few decks that can actually afford to play it. The fact that it needs you to play a brick in driver means you have to have a way to deal with the driver in case you draw it, or in case the driver is still in your deck and Gamma is now gone. That's why, in my opinion, there's only one meta deck right now that can actually effectively play this card, and that's going to be Dragon Link, specifically because of Red Eye's Black Meteor Dragon. So for now, because of the scarcity of decks that can actually use this card, I would put it into the niche category. Moving on to Retaliating Sea. How many spell cards actually summon a monster in this format? There really aren't too many, so for that reason, I wouldn't play it. But on top of that, you're giving your opponent free access to Thrust, the best effective Thrust to add to their hand, because you're going to be having a monster on your side of the field. Now granted, their cards will get banished, but that's not really going to be as impactful if they can just go for Thrust, get whatever they need to out it, and then they're off to the races from there. In reality, there's just so many better hand traps to play, so just don't play Retaliating C, play another card instead. Sauravis, the Ancient and Ascended, is a really interesting hand trap that has a lot of utility in protecting from targeting effects. This can be really good in some matchups and some decks, but it's not going to see play in a wide range. I would say that the best deck that this card would see play in is going to be Rescue, since that deck is so weak to targeted effect negation like Valor and Imperm. But even then, Rescue really wants to take advantage of the rest of their engine and play through that, and most of the time, they might even be able to play through the effects of Imperm or Valor on their Turbulence to be able to just still make a very threatening board. So right now, I think this card is going to be niche, but at the very end of niche for now. Skullmeister is a pretty solid card. It can just be a stop to any card effect that would activate in the graveyard, including trap cards for Unchained, for example. Now, we've already established that pretty much every single meta deck wants to use the graveyard in some way, shape, or form, so having a blanket check to those card effects in Skullmeister can be really good, and for that reason, I'm putting it in the some side decks tier. Our final hand trap is going to be Token Collector. Now, honestly, there are no top decks that make tokens right now, and no, Sorcerer is not a top meta deck, so don't say it is. Right now, this card is just absolutely useless, and for that reason, I have to put it at the bottom of the just don't tier list. And that is it. My tier list for the best hand traps in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Post Age of Overlord is looking like this. I think it's a pretty damn good list, don't you? Well, if you don't, if you think I made some mistakes, then let me know down in the comments and we'll discuss it. If you made it this far in the video, you must have enjoyed it even just a little bit, so do me a favor and hit the like button. If this video hits 60 likes, I'll bring you an amazing guide on the best board breakers in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Post Age of Overlord and how they interact with the best meta decks. Speaking of meta decks, if you want a guide on how to beat one of the best decks in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Today in Rescue Ace, then make sure to check out this video right over here. And finally, consider subscribing for more competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos just like this one and help us reach our end of year goal of 2,000 subscribers. Thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.